Okay, in this section, we're going to look at the basics of null as a concept. Now, null represents the absence of a value. Null references were invented by Tony Hoare in 1964, not in Java, but in algo or an algo derivative. He called the null reference his billion-dollar mistake, so you can get an idea of how people think about null references. 30-odd years later, it was adopted into Java and a host of other languages over time. So in reality, he didn't invent the concept of null, but rather something called the null reference. Null is the absence of a value, and it's a very real concept. So let's look at an example. If you said animal.getBeak, and you could pass in different animals, if somebody passed in a fish and you said get beak, well, what do you return? Most of the fish that I've seen don't have beaks. And so that would be an example of where you might have a null situation as a concept. Now, what you do with it, whether you return a null reference, an optional or whatever, those are all kind of different scenarios. But conceptually, the value is null. So let's look at another example. You might have, say, employee.get middle name, but the particular employee whose middle name you're trying to get doesn't have a middle name. They just have a first name and a last name. So how do you think about the middle name in this scenario? Well, the middle name is conceptually null. They don't have a middle name. Now, the next question is, how do you represent this? Now, you might represent it as an empty string, or you might represent it as null, the null reference, which is literally NULL in Java code, or you might represent it with optional or some other mechanism for wrapping the absence of a value. So the concept of null, it's important to understand that the concept of null is not the same thing as the null reference. The concept of null is very real when something doesn't have a value, and it makes no sense for that thing to have that value necessarily. That's a concept of null. For example, the employee not having a middle name, when we ask for the middle name, what is it? It's conceptually null. And the null reference is one way of representing null, and it's baked into the language with the lowercase null literal in the Java language. Okay,